Good afternoon, friends. Good evening, friends.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone over there.
Welcome, everyone who's listening live tonight to our live podcast, and those of you who are listening on catch-up, either on Google Play or from the iTunes Store. Thanks for listening as well. My name's Father Nicholas Pearce.
Sorry about that.
Technological issues here. And this is Discernment Straight
Up. That's right.
That's right. And last week we did a bit of a pilot episode and there was a few technical issues, but we've decided to persevere. So this is...
Exactly. So this is...
Episode 1. It all starts again and it
1.1
all starts this evening. So we decided that it was important to put together a podcast that looked at discernment, but in particular discernment to the diocesan priesthood in an open and frank manner. And we thought it standing up. So if you're watching live or if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that we're actually standing up because we decided that discernment is too important to talk about sitting down. And that discernment in and of itself is it's an action. It's something that needs to be done rather than sometimes we think that discernment is just a bit of a passive action, but it's not. It's something that we all need to take seriously. So that's where the name comes from.
That's right. And what better way to discern when you got a priest of the Archdiocese over here and a seminarian?
And we're just going to be having a chat. And the format that we're going through at the moment is we're going through Father Brett Brannan's To Save 1,000 Souls, which is a great resource that many young men around Melbourne in particular may have got a copy of. But it's an easy resource to get copies of as well. So you can either speak to your own vocations director, or it is available on Amazon on Kindle, or through in a paper version. There's two versions, and the pages are slightly different in those. But there's an international version, and then there's the American version, and we're using the international version because there is some slight differences between discernment in America, where the original book was written, and also in other parts of the world. And so we're going to go through it using the Melchizedek Project, which is a discussion-based program for college-age students or university students. And we're going to be working through that over the next few weeks. So you don't actually have to have a copy of the book, but if you want to, we're going to be making reference to the book.
It'll be very helpful if you do.
The I suppose a reading plan will be put in the show notes if you do want to follow along. So open and frank conversation about
discernment.
So Jaycee, you're in your 6th year of studies at Corpus Christi College here in Melbourne.
Yes, I am.
You're sort of on the verge of diaconate later this year. But can I take you back to the very beginning? Can you share?
It's going a long way.
Who inspired you to be a priest? Who inspired you to enter into the seminary and to take the first steps?
Oh, well, I think first and foremost, it was our Lord. But if you want to talk about persons who inspired me, it was definitely my parish priest back in St. Francis. And that was our former rector, Father Brendan Lane, I think who's now in Dandenong.
Dandenong. Yeah,
That's
St.
right.
Gerard, not St. Gerard's, St. John? No.
Yeah.
Dandenong Parish.
And he hadn't changed a bit. I think he was going a little bit more deaf when I was in the seminary, but that's what old age does to you.
It does?
It does.
Many years of faithful priestly service.
Oh, yes. Indeed. He was a good example of fatherhood in terms of being practical and also just being a manly presence around the parish. Someone you could sort of set your clock to in terms of being a man of service, a man of charity, a man of the people.
I was very similar. So growing up, I had a very faithful parish priest who was a really wonderful example of the priesthood. And although we never actually had a conversation about it, it was really clear that he was encouraging all the young men of the parish to give some thought to the priesthood. And that was clear through our parish newsletter, and I suppose different material that was available in the church, but it was also just clear by his example of life. And
yes.
He was just a really fine example of the priesthood, and he had a really strong priestly identity that he was proud to be a priest, and it was obvious that he enjoyed being a priest, and he found joy in the priesthood, which is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. Was there any saints? So for me, it was John Paul II, who at that stage was Pope John Paul II. He he was our Pope. And he, again, was just a really finely priestly example, and he's now a saintly priestly example. For you, was there any saints? Or
Yeah, and today we celebrate the feast of Our Lady of Fatima. And the two saints that really motivated me were Francesco and Jacinta.
Okay.
The Seers of Fatima, if you didn't know, but their childlikeness and also their openness to pray and also to Our Lady was just phenomenal. And I think the devotion to the Rosary really got to me, especially praying to Jacinta and Fatima. And what better way to end off the lockdown with Our Lady's feast day today?
Yeah, well, as I said in my homily today to my people, I don't think it was a coincidence.
No, yeah.
I think a real moment of providence that in the middle of this month of Our Lady, on the great feast of Our Lady of Fatima, at least here in Victoria, here in Melbourne, we were allowed to celebrate public liturgies again. In a restricted fashion, but it was wonderful to have people back in the church.
Yes.
A little bit like those two saints, you started your journey to the priesthood quite young. What did your family think?
Our family was a bit apprehensive at the beginning, but I grew up in a Catholic family, and Mum and Dad would go to church often, and I think it was around that time when there was a devotion to Saint John Vianney. And praying for the priesthood, that all the parishes around Melbourne or even around Australia were praying for vocations to the priesthood. And seeing my mum and dad praying every Sunday the prayer for vocations, when I told them, it was like a supportive a network there, and especially supportive for my dad. I think it really touched him that one of his sons was being called to the priesthood. So fortunately enough for me, I know it's different for other boys, but I had a very supportive response from my parents.
And so you obviously grew up in a family of very active faith and regular mass attendance. And as you point out, it is different for different guys. So my family's attachment to the church was probably a little bit looser than that. At some points we had we received the sacraments, and we went to Catholic schools, and we went to Sunday Mass at varying degrees sort of growing up. So it was slightly a bigger jump, a bigger leap of faith for my family, but they were always very supportive because they knew that it was making me happy.
Yep.
And that was my family's first response was, we're happy that you're happy.
Yes.
But I suppose the question of vocation has to go deeper than just happiness. It can't just be something that we do to make us happy. And Father Brett speaks about it in the book in chapters 3 and chapters 4, which is the chapters we're sort of looking at tonight. But he speaks about the difference between happiness and holiness. And that if we're following our vocations, we need to be striving not just for earthly happiness, but we need to be striving for holiness, which comes to us from that first vocation that we receive in our baptism.
Right.
And that each one of us is called at baptism to strive for holiness. What does that mean for you, sort of as a young guy today, or what did it mean for you when you sort of headed into the seminary?
Oh yes. I was called in my late teens, early 20s, and I was already forming relationships with my friends from university, and also with other acquaintances. But for me, that relationship between happiness and holiness, or those two subjects, individually, was about a relationship with Jesus. And I think that if you start with a good relationship with Jesus, he calls you to both be holy and also happy at the same time, and it can be a challenge at the beginning, but that relationship with him only grows if you sort of nourish it, and as you begin your relationship, I think he will request from you as you become more open to his will and to his invitations.
And we were having a little bit of discussion before we came on air about the question of happiness and holiness in pursuing your vocation, and can you be truly happy or achieve holiness if you're following the wrong vocation? But I suppose the more fundamental question before we even get to that point is that holiness and thus happiness is achieved by following that first vocation first. And I think that's a really important first principle for guys who are discerning their vocation. And one of the auxiliary bishops here in Melbourne, when I was a student, gave me a great quote, and I lost the original piece of paper, and I've constantly looked for it. So Archbishop Costello from Perth now, if you're listening to this podcast, or if someone brings it to your attention, it was a quote from St. Francis de Sales, and it really spoke to me early on in my time in the seminary. And he was writing to one of his spiritual directees, who at the time was a married woman. Her husband had died, but she was raising up small children. And she felt this intense desire to become a religious sister.
Yeah.
And so she approached St. Francis de Sales for advice, and his advice simply was, be a holy mother to your children now, and you'll be a holy religious sister in the future in God's time.
Yeah, wow.
And I think that's a really great piece of advice for seminarians, for priests, but for young men who are discerning. Like, if you want to know God's call in the future, the big questions, strive for holiness today.
Yes.
In this first level of vocation, this call to holiness, this baptismal responsibility that we all receive and that we all share in. Get that right, and the rest of the pieces will fall into place.
And it brings us to the question of, like, what are the dangers of not following your vocation? And I think we were discussing this prior to the podcast, is that you don't establish a good relationship with Jesus, that you're listening to other voices in your head. And I think, well, recently, I think in the last few decades, we have had examples of men and women who follow even themselves, like follow an idol of themselves into living a vocation which is really not suited for them. So I think establishing that groundwork.
Yeah, when I first started in the role in vocations, the priest who preceded us in the role, I followed him around and watched him give a couple of school talks, and he had this one line that I saw him deliver a couple of times, and I thought it was, like, honestly, and I apologise for this now, but I thought it was a bit naff to start with, but I found myself turning to it time and time again. And he speaks about if you want to find joy in your life, you have to put things in their right order.
Yes.
And this is so true for our vocation. If we want to follow our vocation and be joyful, be happy, live a fulfilled life, then we need to put things in their right order. And the word joy itself helps us. And this was the bit that I thought was a bit naff, but I'm using it time and time again. To be joyful, we have to put Jesus first, others second, and yourself last. Joy. Joy.
Nice. Jesus first, others second, yourself last. Joy.
And this is really true when it comes to this question of discerning my vocation. If I'm putting myself first and striving to glorify myself or my own needs, it's never going to work. It's going to be disastrous. And as you say, we've seen tragic examples of this in the church in Australia, but in the church around the world, of priests and religious and even lay people who put themselves first and do insurmountable damage to the church, to individuals, and to the community of the faithful.
So Father Brennan calls the first part the primary vocation. I think everyone is called to this primary vocation, which is the call to holiness. But he goes more specific in what he calls, I think, the secondary vocation, which he separates into 4 different states of life. And if I can enumerate them, one of them being married life, priestly life, religious life, and a consecrated single blessed.
Yeah, and he makes a really important point there, and he even addresses it in the book, that there's this constant balance. Is is the single life, is it in and of itself a vocation like the others? And he points out that there's a lot of discussion about it. He speaks about a generous single life. And I think this is one of the important things about any sense of a vocation, is that vocations are given to us by God that we may bear fruit in the world. And that's obvious for the vocation to marriage, that by and large most men are going to be called to. They bear fruit in and through their children and the love that they have for their spouse, and their fruitfulness is obvious in the world in which they see. Religious life, again, it's not to lock myself away into a world or away from the world, or to live in a community because it's easier than living on my own. No, the call to religious life is a fulfillment of the baptismal call and this call to bear fruit. And that might be for contemplatives, that might be through prayer in the world. For actives, that might be through works of service or works of mercy.
The apostolate, yeah.
The priesthood, again, we bear spiritual fruit, but also fruit in the life of the church. One of the biggest fruits, of course, and this is back to that first question, we should be encouraging and inspiring vocations.
Yes.
That's part of our spiritual fruit. And again, priests who do encourage vocations are much more attractive. There's much more joy. So then it comes to this question of the single life. And is the single life in and of itself a vocation? Well, he speaks about the fact it is if it's generous and committed. So there is the reality that there will be people in this life who never marry, who never follow a particular vocation for one reason or another. Now, they can live the rest of their life as selfish bachelors, or they can generously choose to commit their life to the service of
God,
of the church and God and of the community and the well-being of mankind. And again, we've got great examples in our own country and around the world of people who are great teachers, nurses, doctors, missionaries, healthcare workers, a whole variety of people who have generously given over their life in the service
of the church
and mankind. So they're those sort of four vocations, but they all have, again, at their very core, this sense of...
the foundation of holiness.
Yep, holiness that then bears fruit in the life of the person and in the life of the others. So this is this understanding of vocation, which we then need to have a look at in terms of, okay, well, what about discernment of a vocation or a particular vocation? And the topic of this podcast and the topic of the book is in particular diocesan priesthood, but I suppose it applies to any. JC, discernment's not an easy process, especially in those early years. Why do you think it's so hard? Why do you think that so many young people sometimes even avoid it because it's just a bit too challenging? Or when they do try to do it, they get discouraged very quickly.
Well, to answer your first question, it was I think it's just contrary to your own plans. Many men that I know, and also including me, had plans to have family, which is good, to marry, and to eventually have children. I mean, that's good in itself. But I think when the calling came, although it was very exciting, it was very joyous. The reality of foregoing those realities is difficult, and you get tempted. You have a lot of conflict in your own personal life as well as your own sense of worth, and there's a lot of uncertainties in following a life where basically you deny a lot of things like status, power, money, house, security, and that can be very confusing, but in that discernment, you have to really prioritize what we were speaking about a few moments ago, about your relationship with Christ and how that leads to holiness and your eventual happiness. And I think we have to get this straight, is that the primary goal in all this is to make it to heaven. Holiness and happiness are eternal when we reach that goal of heaven. And if you're sort of weighing up the options, let's say, of discerning either or in which vocation. I think the guarantor is that when Jesus calls you to a certain vocation, he ultimately calls you home, and home is heaven. Home is happiness, eternal happiness, and also is the way that you remain saintly.
So there's the age-old question then, can you be happy if you don't discern the right vocation? Or say God is calling you to be a priest, but you end up getting married. Can you be happy? And ultimately, can you get to heaven?
That's a tough question there.
Well, Father Brennan speaks about it in the chapter, so you obviously flicked through those couple of pages.
They were very confronting, so...
Well, he speaks about a number of things, and it's really worth, I suppose, reading. But a good friend once said to me, you will get to heaven, but it will be a lot harder. You will be happy, but there will be always this tinge of sadness that you may not ever even be able to put your finger on as to why. So God's not going to punish you, but your life won't be as fulfilled as it possibly could.
Yes.
And the other thing he speaks about is that discernment of a vocation is really important, because you actually need to also discern how it's going to affect the lives of other people. So in your own discernment, if God is calling you to be a priest, he's calling you to minister to generations of families and children. He's calling you to baptize and to heal and to forgive and to give the last rites. And he has that plan for you. And there's that great Cardinal John Henry Newman quote that God has created you for a definitive purpose that he's given to you and to no other. And he has that plan. And if you don't adequately discern your vocation, then all those good things that he wants you to have done in the world, he's then going to have to find other ways to do it. And we trust that God will be able to do that.
Yes.
But we're thwarting God's plan a little bit. And that's one of the main reasons. And I think there's three reasons why discernment is so hard, especially in today. And one of those is primarily that the devil doesn't want you to discern your vocation.
Yes.
The devil knows how much good work you can do in the life of the church and the world if God is calling you to be a priest. And that doesn't mean that you can't do good work as a married person or as a religious, but if he's calling you to be a priest, Jesus needs priests, and the devil wants to stop priests. So I think that's the first thing. The devil's always going to get in the way, so much so that even last week we tried to start our first podcast and we had technical issues all night.
Yes, it was a bit of a rocky road to the first podcast.
And if the devil can't sort of stop things in any other way, the way that he generally stops them is
technical.
The other thing I think is that we're out of practice of discernment. We don't know how to do it. And especially in our world today that's full of noise and busyness, finding times for silence and listening to the Lord and actually discerning what he's saying in those silences is not as easy as perhaps it used to be. And we're probably not, as priests, we're probably not training well enough to do it. So there's something that we need to work on. I was on a retreat earlier in the year, and the spiritual director said to me, one of the challenges that young people face is that it's not that God speaks to us when it's silence, or when it's silent, but that God's voice is silence. And as soon as we get to those moments of silence where God is speaking to us, we expect something to happen. And when it doesn't happen, we get disappointed. And so we leave and we say, well, God didn't answer my prayers, or God didn't make it clear to me. But it's actually the silence and being able to be comfortable in that silence,
indeed, yes.
which is not always easy.
Yeah, it's very confronting. You have your thoughts to confront, and sometimes they're not very encouraging.
And I think the final point that I think makes it extra hard is that we're actually choosing between two goods.
Yes,
it's not as if one is really bad, marriage is bad, and priesthood is good. You know, it's not that, but we're actually discerning, and this is where it's actually a hard decision. And this is where it is one that it should take a bit of time, and we should take a certain amount of seriousness. And that's why every young man should spend some time asking the question, is God asking me to be a priest? And discerning that. And it's not because we despise marriage, or we're running away from marriage, or we don't think we'd be good husbands or fathers. It really is a matter of listening to what God has to say in the hearts, in your heart.
How did it make you feel when you finally said yes? Like you had the options, and you were in that point where you said yes. Like, what was that feeling like?
I still remember it quite clearly. So I'd been, I was quite lucky. I went to a World Youth Day as a 16-year-old child, and that was where I first felt the call. I had that first sense of a priestly vocation. It then took me a couple of years to work it out, and I did a lot of discernment on my own, and didn't tell anyone. Then I found a priest, a spiritual director, so I discerned with one other.
Nice.
And then at one point he said, it's time to see the vocations director. And I remember leaving his office that day being so angry because he didn't actually give me a phone number or anything.
You had to do the hard work.
I had to do the hard work. So back in the olden days, there was one computer that had the internet on. I went, printed it out, typed, I found the number, printed out the sheet on the sort of dot matrix sort of printer, and carried it around in my jeans pocket for 3 days. Until one day I was praying for the Blessed Sacrament, and I was like, I've been asking for a sign, and I knew it was never going to come, but I really wanted it. And I said, okay, Lord, come on, help me out here. And as I did, I put my hand in the back pocket of my jeans and I fished out the vocations director's phone number. So I walked out of the St. Patrick's Cathedral that day, and anyone who's from Melbourne will know, out the side door of the cathedral, and I was standing at the big pond, which I now know that I was standing on the outside of the office.
Yes. One of your offices.
Well, yeah. So I'm actually speaking on this sort of clunker of an old mobile phone to the secretary who's on the other side of the glass.
Wow.
And I made the appointment. I went and saw him a couple of days later, and I remember walking out of that office feeling as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulder.
Nice, yes.
This thing that I'd been carrying on my own, and then maybe with one or two others for so long, I finally felt that I had shared it with the church.
Yes, wow.
And I think this is a really important point, is that discernment is a two-way street. And there's only ever a certain amount of discernment that you're ever going to be able to do on your own. And so as soon as I handed it over to the church and to the vocations director to help me discern, I felt like at least 50%, if not more, had been taken off my shoulders. What about you?
Oh, mine was not as dramatic as that, but I can recall. I think I started off doing a lot of charity work, and I knew I always wanted to serve others, and I went to a Eucharistic Congress, and they challenged everyone at the Congress, like, if you have a vocation, come up, and we'll help you realize that. And it was then there I was like, I'm going to drop all my things and see this through. I'm not saying that it was as easy as that. There were a lot of hurdles. Fortunately, I had supportive parents, but you had a plan set out for yourself. And I think to confront that plan and say, I'm going to let God just take over my plans and let His will be done. There is so much joy and so much relief after you've surrendered that, and again, it's a double discernment. And the church takes it on with her, and it makes it more easier to carry. There are many times along my experience in the seminary where doubt creeps in, and you pray that you made the right decision. But then you hear His voice again, and He says, persevere, pull through. And And it brings us, it brings me to the question about, there are some people out there, discerning or in a vocation, but are struggling because maybe they made the wrong decision. Maybe they didn't make the necessary steps and choices to discern properly. And that's, I think, the consequences of wrongly, or even not discerning, or leaving it too long, that you've missed the boat.
And that's the purpose of these podcasts, is that prompting and encouragement of the young people of Melbourne in particular, but any young men who are listening, that now's the time.
Yes, now's the
To
time.
take it seriously. The church needs you, and the church is here to accompany you and to walk with you through this discernment process. So we're all out of time tonight, so we've got plenty of opportunities going forward to continue the conversation and to hear more of your story and to really unpack what is going on. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at that big question about celibacy, but also celibacy in relation to the sexual abuse crisis, which has obviously been a really terrible scourge on the church in recent history. So we're going to be looking at the questions of discernment and dating. Should you be dating at the same time as discerning? We're going to look at that big one that you hear quite regularly. Well, what about the permanent diaconate? Don't permanent deacons sort of get it all? They get to marry and still sort of help out at Mass on a Sunday. And then, of course, that big question of God's grace and how God continues to give grace to those whom he calls. So that's next week. If you're reading along in the book, you'll be able to sort of just keep going along as we're going, chapters 5 and 6. That's what we're looking at next week. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. If you're listening live this evening from Melbourne or from the Diocese of Adelaide, you should already have some contact details for a Zoom catch-up immediately following. And if you don't, you can send a message to Catholic Vocations of the Archdiocese of Melbourne on Facebook, and we can be in touch to get those details through to you. So we're doing a quick catch-up after this to continue the conversation, and we'll be joined by a number of other priests and seminarians for that. But otherwise, if you're listening on podcast or catch-up, we just really encourage you to spend some time following the podcast, asking yourself some of those really basic questions. Okay, how am I living out that primary vocation, that vocation that I received on the day of my baptism? How am I living that out, that call to holiness every day? Who's inspiring me to do that? And are there any priests or religious inspiring me? And what am I doing to actively find opportunities to discern God's will in my life? Thanks, JC.
Thanks, Father Nick.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch up with you all soon.